Chapter 8. I was hopelessly unhappy in those last few days before the Christmas holidays. I began to loathe the school irrationally, the way it worked and the way it was planted, blind and prison-like, in the heart of the divine landscape. When Allison's letters stopped, I was also increasingly isolated in a more conventional way. The outer world, England, London, became absurdly and sometimes terrifyingly unreal. The 2 or 3 Oxford friends I had kept up a spasmodic correspondence with sank beneath the horizon. I used to hear the BBC overseas service from time to time, but the news broadcasts seemed to come from the moon and concern situations and a society I no longer belonged to, while the rare newspapers from England that I saw became more and more like their own 100 years ago today features. The whole island seemed to feel this exile from contemporary reality. The harbor quays were always crowded for hours before the daily boat from Athens appeared on the northeastern horizon, even though people knew that it would stop for only 5 minutes, that probably not 5 passengers would get off or 5 get on. They had to watch. It was as if we were all convicts still hoping faintly for a reprieve. Yet the island was so beautiful. Near Christmas, the weather became wild and cold. Enormous seas of pounding Antwerp blue roared on the shingle of the school beaches. The mountains on the mainland took snow, and magnificent white shoulders out of Hokusai stood west and north across the angry water. The hills became even barer, even more silent. I often started off on a walk out of sheer boredom, but there were always new solitudes, new places. Yet in the end, this unflawed natural world became intimidating. I seemed to have no place in it. I could not use it, and I was not made for it. I was a townsman, and I was rootless. I rejected my own age, yet could not sink back into an older. So I ended like Ciron, a mid-air man. The Christmas holidays came. I went off to travel around the Peloponnesus. I had to be alone, to give myself a snatch of life away from the school. If Allison had been free, I would have flown back to England to meet her. I had thoughts of resigning, but then that seemed a retreat, another failure, and I told myself that things would be better once spring began. So I had Christmas alone in Sparta, and I saw the New Year in alone in Pyrgos. I had a day in Athens before I caught the boat back to Phraxos and visited the brothel again. I thought very little about Allison, but I felt about her, that is, I tried to erase her, and failed. I had days when I thought I could stay celibate for the rest of my life, monastic days, and days when I ached for a conversible girl. The island women were of Albanian stock, dour and sallow-faced, and about as seducible as a free church congregation. Much more tempting were some of the boys, possessors of an olive grace and a sharp individuality that made them very different from their stereotyped English private school equivalents, those uniformed pink ants out of the Arnold mold. I had Gide-like moments, but they were not reciprocated, because nowhere is pederasty more abominated than in bourgeois Greece. There, at least, Arnold would have felt thoroughly at home. Besides, I wasn't queer. I simply understood, nailing a lie in my own education, how being queer might have its consolations. It was not only the solitude, it was Greece. It made conventional English notions of what was moral and immoral ridiculous. Whether or not I did the socially unforgivable seemed in itself merely a matter of appetite, like smoking or not smoking a new brand of cigarette. As trivial as that, from a moral point of view. Goodness and beauty may be separable in the north, but not in Greece. Between skin and skin there is only light. And there was my poetry. I had begun to write poems about the island, about Greece, that seemed to me philosophically profound and technically exciting. I dreamt more and more of literary success. I spent hours staring at the wall of my room, imagining reviews, letters written to me by celebrated fellow poets, fame and praise, and still more fame. I did not at that time know Emily Dickinson's great definition. Her publication is not the business of poets. Being a poet is all. Being known as a poet is nothing. The onanistic literary picture of myself I caressed up out of reality began to dominate my life. The school became a convenient scapegoat. How could one compose flawless verse if one was surrounded by futile routine? But then one bleak March Sunday, the scales dropped from my eyes. I read the Greek poems and saw them for what they were, undergraduate pieces without rhythm, without structure, their banalities of perception clumsily concealed under an impasto of lush rhetoric. In horror, I turned to other poems I had written at Oxford, in East Anglia. They were no better, even worse. The truth rushed down on me like a burying avalanche. I was not a poet. I felt no consolation in this knowledge, but only a red anger that evolution could allow such sensitivity and such inadequacy to coexist in the same mind. In one ego, my ego, screaming like a hare caught in a gin, taking all the poems I had ever written, page by slow page, I tore each one into tiny fragments till my fingers ached. Then I went for a walk in the hills, even though it was very cold and began to pour with rain. The whole world had finally declared itself against me. Here was something I could not shrug off, an absolute condemnation. One aspect of even my worst experiences had always been that they were fuel, or finally utilizable, not all waste and suffering. Poetry had always seemed something I could turn to in need, an emergency exit, a lifebuoy, as well as a justification. Now I was in the sea, and the lifebuoy had sunk like lead. It was an effort not to cry tears of self-pity, my face set into a stiff mask, like that of an acrotarian. I walked for hours, and I was in hell. One kind of person is engaged in society without realizing it. Another kind engages in society by controlling it. The one is a gear, a cog, and the other an engineer, a driver. But a person who has opted out has only his ability to express his disengagement between his existence and nothingness. Not cogito, but scribo, pingo, ergo sum. For days after I felt myself filled with nothingness, with something more than the old physical and social loneliness, a metaphysical sense of being marooned. It was something almost tangible, like cancer or tuberculosis. Then one day, not a week later, it was tangible. I woke up one morning and found I had 2 sores. I had been half expecting them. In late February, I had gone to Athens and paid another visit to the house in Kephysia. I knew I had taken a risk. At that time, it hadn't seemed to matter. For a day, I was too shocked to act. There were 2 doctors in the village, one active, who had the school in his practice, and one, a taciturn old Romanian, who, though semi-retired, still took a few patients. The school doctor was in and out of the common room continually. I couldn't go to him, so I went to see Dr. Patarescu. He looked at the sores and then at me and shrugged. Félicitations, he said. C'est. On va voir ça à Athènes. Je vous donnerai une adresse. C'est bien à Athènes que vous l'avez attrapé, oui? I nodded. Les poules là-bas, infectées. Seulement les fous qui s'y laissent prendre. He had an old yellow face and pince-nez, a malicious smile. My questions amused him. The chances were I could be cured. I was not contagious, but I must have no sex. He could have treated me if he had the right drug, benzathine penicillin, but he could not get it. He had heard one could get it at a certain private clinic in Athens, but I would have to pay through the nose. It would be 8 weeks before we could be sure it had worked. He answered all my questions dryly. All he could offer was the ancient arsenic and bismuth treatment, and I must in any case have a laboratory test first. He had long ago been drained of all sympathy for humanity, and he watched me with tortoise eyes as I put down the fee. I stood in his doorway, still foolishly trying for his sympathy. "I am accursed," he shrugged, and showed me out, totally indifferent, a serre notifier of what is. It was too horrible. There was still a week to the end of term, and I thought of leaving at once and going back to England. Yet I couldn't bear the idea of London, and there was a sort of anonymity in Greece, if not on the island. I didn't really trust Dr. Paterescu. One or two of the older masters were his cronies, and I knew they often saw him for whist. I searched every smile, every word spoken to me, for a reference to what had happened. And I thought that the very next day I saw in various eyes a certain dry amusement. One morning, during break, the headmaster said, "Cheer up, Kyrios Urf, or we shall say the beauties of Greece have made you sad." I thought this was a direct reference, and the smiles that greeted the remark seemed to me to be more than it merited. Within 3 days of seeing the doctor, I decided that everyone knew about my disease, even the boys. Every time they whispered, I heard the word syphilis. Suddenly, in that same terrible week, the Greek spring was with us. In only 2 days, it seemed, the earth was covered with anemones, orchids, asphodels, wild gladioli. For once there were birds everywhere, on migration. Undulating lines of storks croaked overhead. The sky was blue, pure, the boys sang, and even the sternest masters smiled. The world around me took wing, and I was stuck to the ground. A Catullus without talent, forced to inhabit a land that was Lesbia without mercy. I had hideous nights, in one of which I wrote a long letter to Allison, trying to explain what had happened to me, how I remembered what she had said in her letter in the canteen, how now I could believe her, how I loathed myself. Even then I managed to sound resentful, for my leaving her began to seem like the last and the worst of my bad gambles. I might have married her. At least, I should have had a companion in the desert. I did not post the letter, but again and again, night after night, I thought of suicide. It seemed to me that death had marked my family down, right back to those 2 uncles I had never known. One killed at Ypres, and the other at Passchendaele. Then my parents, all violent, pointless deaths, lost gambles. I was worse off than even Allison was. She hated life. I hated myself. I had created nothing. I belonged to nothingness, to the néant, and it seemed to me that my own death was the only thing left that I could create. And still, even then, I thought it might accuse everyone who had ever known me. It would validate all my cynicism. It would prove all my solitary selfishness. It would stand and be remembered as a final dark victory. The day before term ended, I felt the balance tip. I knew what to do. The gatekeeper at the school had an old 12-bore, which he had once offered to lend me if I wanted to go shooting in the hills. I went and asked to borrow it. He was delighted and loaded my pocket with cartridges. The pine forests were full of passage quail. I walked up a gully behind the school, climbed to a small saddle, and went into the trees. I was soon in shadow. To the north, across the water, the golden mainland still lay in the sun. The air was very light, warm, the sky of an intense, luminous blue. A long way away, above me, I could hear the bells of a flock of goats being brought back to the village for the night. I walked for some time. It was like looking for a place to relieve oneself in. I had to be sure I couldn't be observed. At last I found a rocky hollow. I put a cartridge in the gun and sat on the ground against the stem of a pine tree. All around me, grape hyacinths pushed through the pine needles. I reversed the gun and looked down the barrel into the black O of my non-existence. I calculated the angle at which I should have to hold my head. I held the barrel against my right eye, turned my head so that the shot would mash like black lightning through the brain and blast the back wall of my skull off. I reached for the trigger. This was all testing, rehearsing, and found it difficult. In straining forward, I thought I might have to twist my head at the last moment and botch the job, so I searched and found a dead branch that would fit between the guard and the trigger. I took the cartridge out and slipped the stick in, and then sat with the gun between my knees, the soles of my shoes on the stick, the right barrel an inch from my eye. There was a click as the hammer fell. It was simple. I reloaded the cartridge. From the hills behind came the solitary voice of a girl. She must have been bringing down the goats, and she was singing wildly, at the limits of her uninhibited voice, without any recognizable melody, in Turkish Muslim intervals. It sounded disembodied, of place, not person. I remembered having heard a similar voice, perhaps this same girl's, singing one day on the hill behind the school. It had drifted down into the classroom, and the boys had begun to giggle, but now it seemed immensely mysterious, welling out of a solitude and suffering that made mine trivial and absurd. I sat with the gun across my knees, unable to move while the sound floated down through the evening air. I don't know how long she sang, but the sky darkened, the sea paled to a nacreous gray. Over the mountains there were pinkish bars of high cloud in the still strong light from the set sun. All the land and the sea held light, as if light was warmth, and did not fade as soon as the source was removed. But the voice dwindled down toward the village, then died into silence. I raised the gun again until the barrel was pointing at me. The stick projected, waiting for my feet to jerk down. The air was very silent. Many miles away I heard the siren of the Athens boat approaching the island. But it was like something outside a vacuum. Death was now. I did nothing. I waited. The afterglow, the palest yellow, then a luminous pale green, then a limpid stained glass blue, held in the sky over the sea of mountains to the west. I waited. I waited. I heard the siren closer. I waited for the will, the black moment, to come to raise my feet and kick down, and I could not. All the time I felt I was being watched, that I was not alone, that I was putting on an act for the benefit of someone, that this action could be done only if it was spontaneous, pure, and moral. Because more and more it crept through my mind with the chill spring night that I was trying to commit not a moral action, but a fundamentally aesthetic one, to do something that would end my life sensationally, significantly, consistently. It was a Mercutio death I was looking for, not a real one. A death to be remembered, not the true death of a true suicide, but the death obliterate. And the voice, the light, the sky, it began to grow dark. The siren of the receding Athens boat moaned, and I sat still smoking, with the gun by my side. I reevaluated myself. I saw that I was from now on forever contemptible. I had been and remained intensely depressed, but I had also been and always would be intensely false. In existentialist terms, inauthentic. I knew I would never kill myself. I knew I would always want to go on living with myself, however hollow I became, however diseased. I raised the gun and fired it blindly into the sky. The crash shook me. There was an echo, some falling twigs, then the heavy well of silence. "Did you kill anything?" asked the old man at the gate. "One shot," I said. "I missed."